Is the Georgia housing market about to head into a big downturn at the end of 2024, entering 2025? In this video, I'm going to give you the data as a Georgia homebuyer investor so you can understand where the market is heading and make a more informed decision. And the first thing we're going to do, everyone, is look at the inventory levels in Georgia, the levels of supply data on Reventure app. You can see we've had a big spike in supply over the last year from 27,000 homes to over 40,000 homes on the Georgia housing market, a roughly 49% year-over-year increase. That big spike in inventory has now caused sellers across Georgia to begin cutting prices, especially in certain parts of Atlanta. With home values now trending down on a month-over-month basis in Fulton County, Clayton County, DeKalb County, and even Cobb County up to the northwest in Marietta, values are starting to drop. Of course, values across Georgia are still very, very high. They boomed during the pandemic with all those people that moved in from New York, California, and Illinois. They bought up the homes in Georgia because they were cheap 3 to 4 years ago, thereby pushing the prices way up for locals. For instance, you can see that the typical value of a home in Atlanta jumped from $240,000 prior to the pandemic to $380,000 today, a massive increase that registers 60% growth over the last 5 years. In addition, a market like Macon has appreciated by 56% over the last 5 years, while Savannah has appreciated by 68%. Take a look at that, everyone. The typical price of a home in Savannah jumped from $200,000 prior to the pandemic to over $340,000 today. That's one of the fastest growth rates in America. So the question facing you guys out there as Georgia home buyers and investors today is, when's the right time to buy? The values went way up during the pandemic. They became very expensive. Now they're starting to drop due to a big surge in inventory, but just how much are they going to drop into the future? And are we going to see a crash play out in Atlanta, in Savannah, much like we saw back in 2008? Home values in Georgia went down a lot in that last crash from 2008 to 2012. In Atlanta, values went down 35%. In fact, there were zip codes in Atlanta where values went down 70%. So could we be on the precipice of that type of big crash, or is this going to be just more of a modest correction? Well, I want to show you folks one thing that has me concerned in Atlanta specifically, and that's the fact that investors are now selling. Take a look at this listing. It's a 5-bed, 3-bath, 2,600 square feet on the market for only $300 grand. That's only $116 a foot. And you can see here the value estimate on this property has dropped from a high of $397,000 in 2022 all the way down to $293,000 today. So that's about a 25% decline in value. We're getting back closer to what it was before the pandemic. And if you look on the listing, you could see that this was owned by an investor. They tried to rent it out. They kept cutting the rent throughout August and September, and then eventually they made the decision to sell. Now, that investor on that house in Atlanta is a company called Progress Residential. They bought that home for way cheap at the bottom of the last housing crash in 2013, something like 130 grand. Now they're trying to sell it for 300 grand. And I'm just seeing more and more of these investors in Atlanta, in Georgia, begin to sell. And when you see the investors begin to sell, particularly the big institutional investors, that's going to just cause you to stop for a second and say, hey, what's going on in this market? Particularly in these zip codes in red, everyone, around the Atlanta metro. And I'm going to get into some other parts of Georgia here in a second, but I really want you folks to focus on Atlanta for a second, because what we're seeing is really interesting. These zip codes in red have what's called an inventory surplus right now. Like out in Lithonia to the east, inventory is now up 99% from the long-term average. Listings have spiked from around 100 to over 300 in 30058 in DeKalb County. So when you see that inventory spike, that's telling you investors are selling, supply is spiking, prices are likely to drop. And the metric really to focus on here on Reventure app, everyone, is the inventory surplus or deficit. If you are in an area in red with an inventory surplus, it is much more likely that home prices decline. So much more likely that prices drop in these areas in red, whereas in these areas in blue, to the north, in these wealthier suburbs in Atlanta, up towards Brookhaven and Dunwoody and Roswell and Sandy Springs, you could see that inventory is still in a deficit. There's still a shortage of inventory in these zip codes in blue. Like out in Roswell, you could see before the pandemic we had 350 homes for sale. Now we only have 170. So the inventory is improving, but it's still low. So that's why the Reventure app home price forecast for 30075 in Roswell is still saying prices up. And what I'm going to impress upon you guys as buyers, investors, realtors, mortgage brokers, if you want to understand your market, you got to zoom in at the zip code level and look at that data on the inventory surplus or the inventory deficit, because that data point in and of itself is going to reveal huge realities about your local housing market. If we're in an inventory surplus, much more likely prices drop. If we're in an inventory deficit, more likely that prices increase. And we're still in an inventory deficit in a lot of wealthy areas in Atlanta, particularly this house. It's a new build in Buckhead. 5 beds, 6 baths. It's $5 million. Look at this house, everyone. Looks really, really nice. Absolutely beautiful house. It's a mansion in Buckhead. But you say to yourself, I mean, who has the money to buy a house like this? I mean, the estimated monthly payment is going to be over 30 grand a month. When you zoom in here on these areas in northern Atlanta near Buckhead, you can see some of the typical home values in these zip codes are insane. Like 30327, the typical value is 1.4 million. That's just the standard house is 1.4 million. So we still have a lot of wealth here north of Atlanta that's still buying homes and pushing prices up. But on the south side, east side, in these areas in blue, we're starting to see the downturn play out. But just how much could home prices fall? I think that's the question that a lot of you want to know the answer to. Are we going to see a 5% correction, a 10% correction, or is it going to be something more along the lines of 20 or 30%, maybe more? Well, to answer that question, on Reventure app, we have a data point called overvaluation rate. And this data point helps you understand how over or undervalued home prices are compared to the long-term norms in your area relative to income. Because ultimately it's the income levels in your area which dictate how much money people have to buy homes. And so if the prices go up way more than the incomes, that's a signal that maybe we're in a bit of a bubble and maybe the situation isn't so sustainable. And I want to show you guys what I'm talking about here, because if you're a home buyer, you need to know this information. So if we were to go, for instance, to the Atlanta as a metro and open it up here, and we click a data point called fair home value here on Reventure app, you can see this gray line shows what the fair home value is relative to income. So October 2024, the fair home value in Atlanta is $286,000 based off income, but the actual value is $380,000. So this signals a bubble. This signals that we have price downside in the Atlanta metro on the order of around 25 to 30%. You can see actually though, this wasn't always the case. In 2017, going back all the way to 08, the fair home value in Atlanta was higher than the actual home value. So actually in this period from 08 to 2017, home values in Atlanta were undervalued. So really what you want to do as an investor or a buyer, like if you want to, get in at a good price and appreciate more into the future, you want to buy into markets that are undervalued relative to income. And so on Reventure app, you can look at that by clicking fair home value under the typical home value, or you can go to the overvaluation rate and see it reflected in percentage terms. And so when the values are below this line, they're in the undervalued territory. When they're above this line, they're in overvalued territory. And so for instance, you can see prices in Atlanta right now are 33% overvalued. In Savannah, they're 24% overvalued. In Macon, they're only 15% overvalued. So Macon actually has some of the lowest overvaluation rates. Down in Valdosta, they're only 6% overvalued. So I would say at this point in the cycle, if you're buying, you'd want to buy in an area with less overvaluation. If you're buying in an area with more overvaluation, there's more of a chance of a downside crash. And this extends all the way down to the zip code level. So there's big differences in over and undervaluation by zip code. Like you can see some of these zip codes to the west and southwest of Atlanta, prices are 50% overvalued, right? Huge disconnection from incomes. In other areas though, prices are undervalued. In 30307, values are actually 2% undervalued, indicating that the incomes have kept up with the home prices. And so it's really about understanding the fundamentals of how over or undervalued your market is and combining that with the short-term technical indicators on the direction of the market, the inventory, the price cuts, the home price forecast scores. If you combine those two together, you're going to have a really solid understanding of what you're getting into as a home buyer or investor across Georgia. And that peace of mind is invaluable, because when you buy a house, you're spending 400 grand, 500 grand, 600 grand, maybe even $1 million. It's the biggest financial decision most of you will ever make. And so you got to make that decision with data on your side and understanding on your side so you don't make the wrong decision. The last thing you want to do is put your hard-earned down payment or savings on a home or investment property to then see it wiped away like we're seeing happen now in a lot of situations in Georgia. People who bought at the peak in 2022 and 2023 are now losing money in certain areas, and you don't want that to happen to you. And so what I would suggest you guys do to really understand the market and have a better clarity on where and when to buy, go to www.reventure.app and focus on the data here in Georgia at the metro level, at the county level, down at the zip code level, and look at that overvaluation rate Look at the 5-year growth rate in home prices so you can understand how much they've gone up, how much they could go down, and then unlock the home price forecast score for your area. This is a score ranked from 0 to 100 that helps you understand the future direction of prices based on the current data. You could see this zip code, we went from a heavy seller's market to a huge buyer's market, indicating prices are likely to drop, indicating if you're a buyer in this area, be prepared for that, maybe make offers below asking price, maybe hold off and wait 3 to 6 months, see where prices go in the future. All that data is available for you on ReventureApp under a monthly pass for the cost of $39 a month, which is ultimately very cheap compared to the cost of buying a home in Atlanta and Georgia these days, folks. These values in Atlanta have gone way up. You're going to make sure you don't make a mistake. Additionally, if you're somebody who wants more of a discount in a long-term perspective, consider that annual pass. You're going to get a 15% discount on the annual pass, knocking it down from $39 to $33 a month. This annual pass is going to help you check the data each month so you can see how things are trending in your market. This is a great option if you're a serious home buyer investor looking to buy over the next 6 to 12 months.